When anybody was doing a movie and they needed a villain or a bad guy, somebody who was really despicable, they'd say, why don't you go out and get Lee Van Cleef? So I got back to the...
Lee Van Cleef was the kind of man who could walk into a room and silence it with just a stare. He wasn't simply an actor who played villains. He became the very embodiment of menace, cold calculation, and unshakable determination on the big screen. Hollywood had seen its fair share of heroes, but villains like Van Cleef were rare, so convincing, so unforgettable, that audiences found themselves both hating and admiring him at the same time. Born in small-town America, hardened by war, and nearly broken by personal tragedy, his journey to cinematic immortality wasn't an easy ride. For decades, he battled typecasting, rejection, and even near-death experiences before finally carving his name into the history of cinema. His story isn't just about the making of a Hollywood legend. It's about resilience, reinvention, and the relentless pursuit of a dream that refused to die. Clarence Leroy. Lee Van Cleef was born on January 9, 1925 in Somerville, New Jersey. He came from humble beginnings in a working-class family, the kind of environment where discipline and hard work weren't just ideals. They were survival skills. His father was a watchmaker, a man who spent long hours bent over intricate gears and ticking mechanisms. From him, Lee learned the value of precision and detail, traits that would later shape the way he crafted his characters on screen. Growing up in small-town America during the Great Depression meant that luxuries were scarce, but Lee's imagination was rich. He was known as a boy who had a sharp edge even then, disciplined, focused, and not afraid of challenges. These qualities followed him into his teenage years, setting the stage for what was to come. When World War II broke out, Van Cleef enlisted in the United States Navy. Serving as a sonar man and later a radio operator aboard minesweepers, he wasn't just doing a job. He was absorbing experiences that would forever alter his perspective. Combat missions across the Atlantic toughened him, instilled a stoic resilience, and gave him that hardened stare that would later become his trademark as an actor. Every close call with danger, every sleepless night on the sea, left an impression that shaped his demeanor both in life and in art. After the war ended, Van Cleef pursued higher education at the University of South Carolina, where he briefly studied accounting and engineering. It seemed like a practical path, a stable career. But deep down, Lee knew he wasn't built for a desk job. The stage was calling, and he couldn't ignore it. By the late 1940s, he began experimenting with community theater. With his tall frame, chiseled face, and commanding presence, he quickly drew attention. Directors noticed his ability to hold an audience even when he barely spoke. He had the kind of presence you couldn't teach. It was natural, raw, and captivating. What he didn't know was that Hollywood, though still far away, was waiting for him. Breaking into Hollywood is never easy, and for Lee Van Cleef, the road was paved with frustration, disappointment, and endless rejections. When he finally made the move to California, he wasn't greeted with immediate stardom. Instead, he found himself cast in bit parts, roles that often went uncredited. He played anonymous henchmen, soldiers, and outlaws, characters with no depth and no dialogue. His first real brush with recognition came in High Noon, 1952, a classic Western starring Gary Cooper. Van Cleef appeared as Jack Colby, one of the silent henchmen. The role required no lines, just a menacing stare. Ironically, that single stare, cold, sharp, and filled with menace, became the reason directors began to notice him. Hollywood loved his look, but it was a double-edged sword. Van Cleef's angular face, piercing eyes, and hawk-like profile made him the perfect villain. He looked ruthless, untrustworthy, and dangerous, even when he wasn't trying. And so, typecasting began to define his career. For much of the 1950s, he played an endless parade of outlaws, gang members, and secondary villains. His characters, rarely had names, motivations, or even lines. At the same time, Lee's personal life began to weigh him down. A devastating car accident in the late 1950s nearly derailed his career permanently. The injuries left him with chronic pain that lasted for years. Acting, especially in action-heavy westerns, became more difficult. Combined with financial struggles and a failed marriage, Lee found himself at one of the lowest points of his life. By the early 1960s, he was typecast, struggling for significant work, and battling his own demons. Hollywood had little interest in giving him meaningful roles. But what no one realized then was that Van Cleef was about to meet a director who would see in him not just a villain, but a star in his own right. The turning point in Lee Van Cleef's career came when Italian filmmaker Sergio Leone entered the picture. By the mid-1960s, Leone was reinventing the Western genre with his iconic spaghetti westerns, films that blended American grit with European style. Leone had already worked with Clint Eastwood on A Fistful of Dollars, 1964, and for his next films, he needed actors who could embody complexity, menace, and silent strength. Leone saw Van Cleef not as a background villain, but as someone who could bring depth to central characters. In 1965, he cast him as Colonel Douglas Mortimer in For a Few Dollars More. This was a breakthrough role. For the first time, Van Cleef wasn't just a nameless outlaw. He was a fully fleshed-out character, a man driven by motives, honor, and vengeance. His performance opposite Clint Eastwood was magnetic. Audiences finally saw what Lee had always known. He was more than just a villain. But the real game changer came in 1966 with The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Cast as Angel Eyes, a ruthless, cold-blooded bounty hunter, Van Cleef delivered one of the most chilling performances in cinema history. Against Eastwood's stoic hero and Eli Wallach's unpredictable Tuco, Van Cleef's Angel Eyes stood out as the embodiment of pure menace. His stare alone carried more weight than most actors could deliver in full monologues. The film's international success transformed Van Cleef overnight. He was no longer a struggling character actor. He was now an international star. Europe especially embraced him, with audiences adoring the sharp features, piercing eyes, and restrained intensity that became his signature. The contrast between his Hollywood struggles and his sudden rise to global fame couldn't have been more dramatic. After years of rejection, injury, and personal setbacks, Lee Van Cleef was finally recognized as one of the greatest Western actors of all time. After the success of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Lee Van Cleef became a household name, especially in Europe, where spaghetti westerns were celebrated as cultural milestones. His ability to portray both ruthless antagonists and morally complex anti-heroes set him apart from other actors of his generation. In For a Few Dollars More, 1965, Van Cleef gave one of his most memorable performances as Colonel Douglas Mortimer, a retired military man turned bounty hunter. Unlike his earlier typecast roles, Mortimer was more than just a killer. He was intelligent, calculating, and deeply human. His interactions with Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name created a dynamic partnership that elevated the film. Viewers connected to Mortimer's motives, particularly his personal vendetta, which gave the role an emotional weight that audiences didn't expect from a so-called villain. Then came Angel Eyes in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, 1966. Van Cleef took what could have been a flat, one-note villain and transformed him into something more terrifyingly real. With little dialogue, he relied on body language and that infamous stare, cold, unblinking, and merciless. His portrayal made Angel Eyes one of cinema's most enduring antagonists. Even decades later, his performance is cited as one of the greatest villain portrayals in movie history. The late 1960s brought even more significant roles. In The Big Gundown, 1966, Van Cleef played Jonathan Corbett, a lawman hired to track down a fugitive. What made the role stand out was its complexity. Corbett wasn't just a gun for hire. He was a man wrestling with morality, justice, and the corruption of those around him. The film gave Van Cleef space to showcase depth and range, proving he could do far more than stare menacingly from the shadows. Death Rides a Horse, 1967, paired him with John Philip Law in A Tale of Revenge. Here, Van Cleef's character, Ryan, became a mentor figure, guiding a younger gunslinger while dealing with his own past demons. His ability to balance menace with wisdom gave the film a tragic dignity, showing audiences a softer, more layered side of the actor. By the 1970s, Van Cleef had firmly established himself as one of the greatest Western stars, joining the ranks of Clint Eastwood and John Wayne. Unlike Wayne, who often embodied the noble American hero, Van Cleef thrived in the gray areas of morality. His characters were unpredictable, sometimes villains, sometimes reluctant heroes, but always unforgettable. His career also extended beyond Leone's films. He appeared in Day of Anger, 1967, where he played another seasoned gunman guiding a younger protege. In these mentor roles, audiences saw a man aged by life, hardened by experience, yet still powerful and commanding. They showcased Van Cleef's versatility in bringing both strength and vulnerability to the screen. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Van Cleef's Western legacy was cemented, but he also began branching out into other genres. His rugged presence and unique charisma allowed him to step into new roles without losing the magnetic quality that made him famous. Though Westerns defined his legacy, Lee Van Cleef's talents stretched far beyond the dusty landscapes of the frontier. By the late 1970s, as the popularity of Westerns declined, he sought new challenges in the evolving world of action and adventure films. One of his most notable appearances outside the Western genre came in John Carpenter's Escape from New York, 1981. Cast as Police Commissioner Bob Hoke, Van Cleef exuded authority and menace in equal measure. His performance proved that he didn't need a cowboy hat or revolver to command the screen. His very presence carried weight. Acting opposite Kurt Russell's Snake Plissken, Van Cleef's Hawk became one of the film's highlights, a testament to his ability to adapt to new cinematic landscapes. In The Octagon, 1980, he starred alongside martial arts legend Chuck Norris. Here, Van Cleef played a mentor-like figure once again, blending his trademark grit with wisdom. The combination of martial arts action and Van Cleef's imposing persona introduced him to younger audiences who hadn't grown up with spaghetti westerns. Television also became an important avenue for him in the 1980s. In The Master, 1984, Van Cleef took on the role of John Peter McAllister, a martial arts expert and ninja master. While the series was short-lived, it showcased Van Cleef's willingness to experiment with roles outside his comfort zone. It also allowed him to reach a new generation of viewers who may not have been familiar with his earlier work. Through these projects, Van Cleef demonstrated an ability to reinvent himself. He wasn't afraid to step outside the boundaries of his established image. Whether as a mentor, an authority figure, or even a reluctant hero, his distinct voice, sharp features, and commanding aura ensured that he remained memorable no matter the role. By diversifying his career, Van Cleef solidified his reputation as more than just a Western actor. He was a true chameleon of cinema, capable of delivering powerful performances across genres. Behind the steely eyes and cold stare, Van Cleef's personal life was filled with both joy and hardship. His first marriage was to Patsy Ruth in 1943, during his early years before stardom. Together, they had 3 children, Alan, David, and Deborah. While the marriage lasted over a decade, the pressures of Hollywood, financial strain, and Van Cleef's demanding career eventually took their toll. By 1958, the marriage ended in divorce, leaving Lee to balance fatherhood with the struggles of his uncertain career. In 1960, he married Joan Marjorie Drain, entering a new chapter at a time when his career was in flux. Joan stood by him during one of the most critical points of his life, his near-fatal car accident. The crash left him with severe injuries, including damage to his knee that nearly ended his acting career altogether. For years, he lived with pain, but his determination pushed him forward. Joan's support during these difficult years proved invaluable, though the marriage eventually ended in divorce in 1974. In 1976, Van Cleef married again, this time to Barbara Havalone. This partnership lasted until his death, marking a period of relative stability in his personal life. Despite his intimidating on-screen persona, those close to him often described Van Cleef as warm, funny, and deeply loyal to his loved ones. Yet personal struggles were never far away. He battled health issues throughout his later years, including heart problems that limited his activity. Despite these challenges, he continued working, refusing to let illness define him. His dedication to acting never wavered, even as his body began to slow down. Van Cleef's personal life reflected the same resilience that defined his career. He faced setbacks, heartbreak, and pain, but he always pressed forward, determined to keep moving, to keep fighting. Lee Van Cleef passed away on December 16, 1989, at the age of 64, from a heart attack. His death marked the end of an era, but his legacy only grew stronger with time. Today, Van Cleef is remembered as one of the most iconic actors of the Western genre. His roles in Sergio Leone's films remain benchmarks for villainy and complexity, inspiring generations of actors who sought to bring depth to antagonistic roles. Unlike many villains who are quickly forgotten, Van Cleef's characters lived on, immortalized by his unique ability to make menace both terrifying and strangely admirable. Beyond Westerns, his work in action films and television expanded his fan base, ensuring that his legacy reached audiences across multiple generations. He proved that a man once trapped in typecasting could break free and redefine himself on his own terms. Lee Van Cleef's piercing eyes, sharp features, and commanding presence remain etched in cinematic history. More than just a villain, he was an artist who gave life, depth, and dignity to roles that others would have played as caricatures. His story is a testament to perseverance, reinvention, and the enduring power of cinema. For all his grit and screen presence, Lee Van Cleef's career almost ended before it truly began. In the late 1950s, during a period when his Hollywood journey was already stagnating, tragedy struck. A near-fatal car accident left him badly injured. His left knee was shattered, doctors warning him that he might never fully recover. Walking without pain seemed impossible, and the idea of performing action-heavy roles, so central to Westerns, was nearly out of the question. For a man who thrived on discipline, the accident was devastating. The physical pain was relentless, but the psychological toll cut even deeper. Casting agents, who already saw him as nothing more than a one-note villain, now dismissed him outright. Some even whispered that his career was over, that his days of riding horses and drawing guns on screen were finished. But Van Cleef refused to surrender. Through sheer determination, he pushed himself to recover. Physical therapy was grueling, often leaving him exhausted and in agony, yet he persisted. He knew he had no choice. Acting wasn't just a career for him anymore. It had become his lifeline. The accident scarred him physically, leaving him with a permanent limp and chronic pain that would follow him for the rest of his life. Yet, in a strange twist, those very scars became part of his screen persona. The limp, the stiffness, the pained movements, they gave his characters a world weariness, a sense that they had been through battles both seen and unseen. It was authenticity that no acting school could teach. In hindsight, the accident might have been the making of Lee Van Cleef rather than the end. It stripped him of vanity, forced him to adapt, and added depth to his performances. Every role he took afterward carried an undercurrent of survival. He wasn't just playing hardened men, he was one. If there's one man who saw Lee Van Cleef's true potential, it was Sergio Leone. The Italian director, known for his unorthodox vision and bold casting choices, had an eye for spotting overlooked talent. Where Hollywood saw a background villain, Leone saw an actor capable of commanding the screen. Casting Van Cleef in for a few dollars more was a gamble, but it paid off spectacularly. Leone admired Lee's precision, the way he delivered dialogue with restraint, the way he could communicate volumes with just a glance. To Leone, Van Cleef embodied the mythic qualities of the Western: silence, danger, and mystery. Clint Eastwood, too, became an important counterpart in Lee's career. The two men couldn't have been more different on screen. Eastwood, the silent anti-hero, and Van Cleef, the sharp-eyed hunter. Their chemistry was electric, creating rivalries and partnerships that audiences couldn't look away from. And for a few dollars more, their uneasy alliance was built on tension and mutual respect. In the good, the bad, and the ugly, their roles. As adversaries elevated both performances, off-screen, there was no animosity. In fact, Eastwood often spoke respectfully of Van Cleef's talent, acknowledging the strength he brought to their films together. While they weren't close friends in the Hollywood social sense, they shared a bond forged by their work in Leone's cinematic universe. Leone, Eastwood, and Van Cleef formed a trinity that redefined the Western genre. Without Van Cleef, those films would have lacked the cold, calculating menace that balanced Eastwood's quiet heroism. Their collaboration wasn't just professional, it was alchemy.